about the injury. It's not about the injury. It's about the recovery. It's about the recovery.
Hey folks, Paul Padda here with the Paul Padda Podcast, coming to you from Red Chimp Studios. Today I have a very special guest, someone I've known for many years and admired, Jacob Reynolds, constitutional law attorney, election law attorney. And Jacob, you and I kind of go back. I was a federal prosecutor over at the federal courthouse, and you were a law clerk.
Yep, working for Judge Hunt.
It's been a number of years, but you've done very well. I'm very impressed with your background and where you've ended up.
Thank you.
So I know you're running for judge. You actually have an interesting sort of subspecialty. Apart from being a business lawyer, you also have developed sort of a niche practice in constitutional law.
Yep.
And election law stuff, right?
Yeah, I've had the privilege. You know, it's hard to have opportunities to actually work in constitutional law issues. A lot of attorneys want to do that when they go to law school, and the problem is they just don't come up as often. So unless you're practicing criminal law, where you're constantly dealing with people's constitutional rights, like something like reasonable search and seizure, that kind of thing, it's harder to get into other constitutional issues like Voting Rights Act cases or election law cases, simply because elections happen, you know, every couple years, and Voting Rights Act cases happen every 10 years.
How is it that you all of a sudden, you transitioned to being a constitutional lawyer and doing election law? Because that's actually pretty rare. There are not a lot of lawyers that do that kind of work.
Right, so a lot of that comes from working with just the right people. And so Mark Hutchison, obviously a very well-known name, former Lieutenant Governor of Nevada, also a strong attorney, very good attorney.
Yes.
He's the one who brings in those cases, and because of my background in the federal court, I was allowed to and brought into the case.
Now, election law is essentially, it is constitutional law, right?
Right, so there's certain concerns where, so the primary kind of constitutional aspect is one person, one vote, equal vote. Like my vote has to count as much as your vote.
Right.
There can't be any kind of differential because of race, religion, gender, you know, any kind of these protected issues we have in America. That's one of the things that makes us great, is we say everybody has to have an equal representation. And so that's where the constitutionality comes in. When somebody's vote is diluted or made more powerful than another person's vote, that's when the courts need to be involved to say that's unconstitutional behavior.
So constitutional law, I mean, encompasses a very broad gamut of activity.
Sure.
People often think that some things are constitutional law violations when in fact they're not. So for example, I think most people think of, when they think of a constitutional law violation, they might think of a law enforcement officer abusing their authority. You know, that's certainly at least the context in which, a 1983 action or some type of situation where a government actor, let's say a greeter at Walmart or a private security guard, you know, handcuffs you. That's not a constitutional law violation, right?
So constitutional violations occur when the government is acting, right? So if you go to a private university and they don't want you to say something, all right, well, that's a private university. But if you go to UNLV and you want to say something, they're under a different rubric because they're a state functioning institution, and they have to allow you to. You will show up at a nightclub in
a tank top and they kick you out. That's not a constitutional.
That's not a constitutional issue. You call somebody at that same nightclub some choice words, and they might punch you in the face, and they haven't violated your constitution. That may be a battery, assault and battery, but it's not going to be a constitutional violation.
So how did in the and I'm asking these questions for the benefit of my viewers, because I think a lot of people don't really understand that. That's a very I think enlightening thing for many people when they discover that, not everything is a constitutional law violation.
Right.
Because in popular culture, movies, etc., people tend to think is everything, but it has to be a government action. How is it that in the 1960s, when people were denied access to private establishments, how did that become a constitutional law violation?
So that becomes a constitutional law violation essentially because you're dealing with rights of public access, and really you're talking about some of that comes in through, rather than a non-traditional way like
interstate commerce.
Interstate commerce, specifically, for example, people were discriminated against. They couldn't check into a hotel because of their race, for example. And so the case law that actually says that's a constitutional violation says, look, the federal government gets to regulate interstate commerce. People are traveling between states and they're trying to stay in a hotel. Hotels participate in interstate commerce, so the federal government can interact. So the federal constitution applies.
Yeah.
And
Because
so
we are a United States of America, which I think
Right.
people sometimes stop when you stop and think about it. Each state is almost like a sovereign territory. Well, it is in the eyes of the Constitution, and then it's united by a federal constitution.
Right. So that's how it applies, and people. So once you can show a constitutional right, then you can go to the court and challenge it, and you can go to state or federal court depending on what your challenge is.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, talking about election law, how does that implicate constitutional law issues?
So going back to what I said is like at the core of it is our votes need to be equal.
Yeah.
No matter who we are, where we come from, our votes have to be equal. So Voting Rights Act, the typical case of this is every 10 years we do redistricting. Right now we're doing the census here in Nevada. Everybody should participate in that. But after the census is done, what happens?
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's a really important point that you just made. And I think a lot of people, in their mind, when they think of the census, they think, well, it's just society's trying to figure out how many people of different racial backgrounds, et cetera, live in a particular place, or the demographics, men versus women. But the census actually has major and significant implications as far as elections and how government is formed, correct?
Right. No, I've been to the judge's office are nonpartisan, so I've been going to different political events, and every party wants their people to participate in the census because what happens is government funds are also allocated on that basis. So if you have kids in school, you want to make sure that you are counted and your kids are counted in that census because then more federal funds will come to Nevada to help in schooling, or more federal funds will come to help with, it could be from homeless, for healthcare, it can be anything. But it's essentially about they calculate about $20,000 in benefits per person counted in the state. So
So that's actually another great point you just made. The census is beyond Republican versus Democrat.
Oh, absolutely. Everybody wants you to count.
It's about Nevada and
Exactly.
Nevadans. I mean, of course, every state has their own interests, but what you're really saying is that if we have an accurate census and our population is properly taken account for, it has a direct impact in terms of how much federal money we get. It might even mean us getting an additional congressional seat.
Right. It could be an additional congressional seat, which also involves more seats in the Electoral College. We become a more important state for the election, the federal presidential election. Everything counts, and you want to participate in that. Everything is anonymous. It's very strict in the law that every answer on your census is anonymous. So, I mean, if anything ever came out from your census, you would have a very good claim against the government for that.
Right.
But the law is very clear that everything is to be anonymous on that.
Jacob, we're going to take a short break. This is a segment of the show I call Paul Padda for the People, where we throw out some legal tips and pointers.
Good.
And we'll be back with that. Paul Padda for the People. Hi folks, Paul Padda for the People with another helpful tip. Have you heard the adage, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law? Well, guess what? That applies in personal injury claims, not just in court of criminal law. If you've been injured in a car accident, be very careful what you post to social media, because an insurance company is going to look at that and use it against you to undermine your claims. How many times have we looked at social media and seen people posting things that we know are not necessarily accurate or 100% correct? Well, anything you post on social media can be misleading and be misconstrued to say, oh, this person's not really injured. So don't put a picture of yourself bungee jumping or doing the zip line at Fremont Street if you've been injured, because an insurance company is going to use it against you. That's one of the most important things I can tell you. Be careful what you post to social media if you've been in an accident. This is Paul Padda for the People with another helpful tip. Hey folks, welcome back to the Paul Padda Podcast. We're with attorney Jacob Reynolds, who is a constitutional and election law attorney and has done some really high profile work in that area. Jacob, so this is a question I think a lot of people have. They've heard the phrase gerrymandering. We've all read about issues in court where a judge is deciding about a congressional district. So a lot of people, I think it's kind of confusing. What does gerrymandering mean?
So gerrymandering is essentially when you draw the maps that decide who votes for what person, right? So in a congressional district, what's the congressional district map? In Nevada, we have 4 congressional districts. What do those maps look like?
So if I live in Henderson, and if I want to know where do you draw the line? Why is my congressional district, why does it encompass this part of town, but not that part of town? Yeah.
Why does Henderson's map include
I guess that's the
Mesquite
question, right?
so
is that raises gerrymandering type issues.
So gerrymandering, there's rules that follow. So we were talking about the census. Every 10 years, every state has to redistrict, meaning they have to draw new maps for all their representatives based on what the census tells them is their population. And so the issues there are like we talked about Nevada might pick up an extra congressional seat. Well, that's because another state lost a congressional seat.
Right.
And so that state would have to redraw their maps anyway, and we would have to redraw our maps, obviously. But the other thing is, anybody who's been here the last 10 years know that there's been a lot of development in certain areas of town and not as much in others. So there's been enormous population shifts. And once again, we want to make sure both of our votes count the same. So if there's over the 10 years, if there's 100,000 more people in my district and you lost, say, 20,000 people in your district, then all of a sudden your vote starts counting more in the Assembly and Nevada State Assembly and the Nevada Senate, because my representative is representing 200,000 people and your representative is representing 80,000 people.
Right.
So this is what happens every 10 years in every state across the country. So every 10 years, every state is mandated to redraw their maps. And
obviously
gerrymandering,
a contentious issue.
Right. So gerrymandering is where the sausage is made. It's just like so. And if you've ever seen these, we have some maps where they really look like ink blot kind of tests. So just like throwing something on a page looks like an amoeba,
right?
And they're really horrendous. But the Supreme Court looks at it as, look, that really is, they strongly favor maps that are approved in the normal course, where it's look, they understand this is the province of the legislature, and it's obviously extremely political. And so,
of course.
So now what happened to us in 2011, so they do the census every 10 years. In 2010, they do the census. 2011, they redraw the maps. We had a Republican governor and a Democrat Senate and Assembly, so they did not agree on what the map should look like, and we went to court. And
you played a big role in that case.
So I was representing parties in that case, and it was very interesting because we had Governor Sandoval, who wanted to have what's called a minority majority district. So there's different rules for what you can do to draw maps. You cannot draw maps to exclude, once again, people of a certain gender or race or religion. You can't exclude. However, on the other side of the coin, you can draw maps to help that group gain representation in something like Congress. So Governor Sandoval, for example, our first Hispanic governor, wanted to have what's called a majority minority district for Hispanic people. But the lines looked pretty much like an octopus. So people call that, some people attack that and say, well, that is called packing. You're just trying to take people who would vote a certain way, a certain political way, and you're trying to put them all in one district. So the accusation there was Republicans would have 3 congressional seats and Democrats would only have 1, or they would have 2 guaranteed congressional seats and only have 1 battleground and 1 guaranteed. So it's this battle. How do you draw those maps? So in Las Vegas, there was actually a very strong contingent of people from the black community who came out and said, we want this area, and they identified the area. We want to be in one Senate district. We want to be in these assembly districts. We believe we are one community. And so they came out in good numbers and testified, we want to preserve this community in our voting blocks. And so we did. But the counter argument to that would have been, if we had split that up and tried to pull those people apart, they would have had a constitutional challenge on that front. They said they could have said, you are diluting our vote. as minorities, and you're not allowed to do that under the law, and they would have been correct.
Do you think we're going to get another congressional seat in this state?
I don't know. I'm not sure on the numbers on that. I know it's a possibility, but it really depends on who shows up and who receives it. But so everybody go out there and get the vote.
Get counted in the
get counted,
yeah.
and we'll see if we can get another congressional seat. That'd be a good thing.
So I remember when you were a law clerk and I'd see you around the federal courthouse and you were bright-eyed and just starting your career. I'm like so impressed. You turned into such a smart guy.
Turned into like
It's
after I
impressive.
finished that clerkship, I started reading some books, and it was great.
Yeah, well, you've done well, my friend. Very
Thank
impressive.
you very much.
Honestly,
You've done well as well. Thank you so much
you.
for having me.
Constitutional law and election law, that's really like rarefied and very unique, and it's impressive to have someone with your background in our state doing the kind of work you do.
Thank
you so much for coming on the show.
Pleasure being here,
Jacob,
Paul.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, folks, that's a wrap for another episode of the Paul Padda Podcast. Have been very honored and privileged to have constitutional lawyer Jacob Reynolds here. Until next time, be safe.
It's not about, it's not about, it's not about the